Quickly done. Thank you, Karen. Hello, everyone. Tom Sanford, Executive Director with North Olympic Land Trust. It's good to see everybody again. I know it was just a couple months ago that we were here with this group talking about the economic benefit report that we had worked on with the Trust for Public Land for North Olympic and Jefferson Land Trust together. Something that's been going on with our organizations is like this group and this group's mission statement, we really are looking to how are we going to have a peninsula that continues to thrive and be climate resilient, really making sure that our economic, our ecological, our social, cultural community and communities stay strong. And we recognize that the climate conversation really then starts to focus on really three main categories of things we can do. One are things that are really about emissions reductions. And we all recognize that each of us as individuals can make little things for emissions reductions, and together we can have impacts, especially on a large policy and global level. But we also were looking at our work as an organization and felt we had modest, small things to do on a global, extremely small things to do on a global scale for reducing emissions. A second category is to mitigate what's going on with greenhouse gases. And that is something that here on the peninsula, we do have some ability to make some positive motions, oftentimes through carbon sequestration, whether in forests or wetlands and such. And so that is something that we are aware of. However, we really felt like the point where impact can happen is we want to make sure that here on the peninsula, our quality of life can maintain and resiliency can maintain, even in a world of climate change. And data is coming out there that's really helping us have a much better understanding, not just of what global ice caps are going to do and the fate of polar bears and things like that, but we're really getting to the point where we're getting an understanding of what is going to happen here. And so our two land trusts, and I'm going to do this introduction and we'll have Richard, the director at Jefferson Land Trust, do a little lead into the questions and answers. We decided, let's work together and do some data and find out what is going on and be able to gather that data and then make really wise, intelligent decisions about land use decisions and land use opportunities. But we recognize that this data isn't just helpful for land use things. It's stuff that others in this group, we have a feeling you're going to look at this stuff and go, well, cool, it's helpful to see what land trust for conservation might do, but I am seeing these ideas that might be helpful in other things I do. And we wanted to help allow this information to be available to you. And so what we did was we acquired some funding from the Land Trust Alliance and the Doris Duke Charitable Fund, as well as the Sustainable Path Foundation and a number of very generous donors. And we're able to hire Core GIS and Matt Stevenson to do some deep diving into looking at what the impacts of climate are going to be in this community and what that's going to start to look like on our landscape. We have not been disappointed. Matt is a GIS specialist and a cartographer, and what I am a map geek, and what I love about a good map is it just helps to make something be real and tangible and start to make it come to life. So the findings you're about to see are focused here on the peninsula. They do have a bit of a land lens because it was hired by two land trusts, but we hope that the information presented today you might find helpful in other things you do. And it's just good information. We did base this work. Some of our initial efforts were based on some of the work done by NODC, I believe with some of the leadership of Kate Dean at that time in 2015 on looking at infrastructure needs on the peninsula in relation to climate. I know there's some work NODC is just now launching on this front, and hopefully this can be used to help springboard that for great impact. So here we go, and just, well, actually, Matt's going to cover the thing I was about to say, so I'll leave it at that. But I do want to make sure to give huge thanks to Michelle Canali at North Olympic Land Trust and Eric Kingfisher at Jefferson Land Trust, who really took the lead on working on this project and bringing the information you're about to see to fruition. We're going to have Matt give a presentation. Richard's going to give it a little bit of context, and then we hope to have some time for Q&A. So with that, I'm looking really quickly, Richard, if I'm forgetting anything.
Nope, you got it.
All right, with that, I'd like to pass this off to Matt Stevenson, GIS guru with Core Analysis, Core GIS.
Thanks for that introduction, Tom. And thank you all for giving me this opportunity to share the work that I've been privileged to do with the North Olympic and Jefferson Land Trusts over the past 2 years. It's been a real treat for me to get to learn more about the peninsula and get to work with Eric and Michelle so closely. So with that, I'm going to try to share my screen and show you a whole bunch of maps and describe to you the work that we've done together. All right. Can everyone see the first slide?
Looks good, Matt.
All right, very good. So after that great introduction, I'll tell you just a little bit about what you're going to hear from me. You're going to get a pretty quick review of a lot of GIS mapping, data gathering, and analysis. It's going to be organized in 5 broad categories. I'm going to give you an overview of what climate change models and predictions are showing for the peninsula, and then explain how we've tried to identify potential opportunities across 4 pillars. These pillars are the way the 2 land trusts organize their work: habitat and biodiversity, working forests, working farms, and community. As Tom said, Richard will provide a summary, and then we'll all be available for Q&A. So climate change modelers have been working for decades to try to figure out what the increased concentrations of CO2 are going to do to our climate. As Tom alluded to, up until very recently, these were very coarse global continental scale models, but the data are getting better, our computing power is getting better, and we're now able to get a pretty clear sense of how things are likely to turn out for us. So some of the changes that are forecasted by the climate change modelers for the Olympic Peninsula include a reduction of summer stream flows, an increase in winter stream flows, increased stream temperatures, diminished snowpack, the delayed onset of winter and freezing temperatures, coastal inundation due to sea level rise, and the prospect of internally displaced climate refugees seeking more comfortable places to live. So let's have a look at some of those things. This map is showing forecasted changes to summer stream flows by 2040. This work was done by the US Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. The darker red and heavier the line, the greater the decrease in summer stream flow by 2040, largely due to a diminished snowpack. Conversely, in the winter, we can anticipate that most of the precipitation, or a significant chunk of that precipitation, will be falling as rain rather than snow. So the heavier and darker blue the line that you see here, the higher the winter stream flow is forecasted for 2040. For temperatures, pretty much every stream and river on the peninsula is forecasted to see an increase in temperature, but the heavier, redder streams and rivers will be seeing the largest increases in temperature by 2040. Again, this work was done by the US Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. Sea level rise projections are tricky, but the Climate Impacts Group has done a pretty good job modeling the probability of different levels of inundation by different dates. So this animated map that you're seeing is taking data from NOAA. It's called their bathtub model. If you just pour water into the ocean, where does it go? So what we're seeing here is a potential for 4 feet of sea level rise with an additional 2 feet that could happen due to king tides and storm surge. This is a fairly low probability, and I would say this is one of the more extreme ends of the forecast that the Climate Impacts Group has put out. But under the high emissions scenario, there's still a non-zero probability that this could happen by the year 2100. The date of freeze, as it currently stands here, is depicted in shades of blue and red. The darker blue the earlier it freezes. And so as we would expect, the higher elevations are going to get colder faster, and the lower elevations are going to get colder slower or later in the year. By 2090, it will happen much later in the year for most of the peninsula, and places that freeze now may not be freezing by 2090. The higher elevations will still see freezing temperatures, but not until much later in the year. So pretty big change in the onset of winter for the peninsula. Throughout the entire United States, there will also be changes, and some of these impacts will be far more extreme than we can expect to see on the peninsula. The New York Times published a series of maps and analyses back in September of 2020. This is just one of the maps, and this is showing the weeks per year that are forecasted to be above 95 degrees by the year 2060. Some portions of the desert Southwest and in the southeastern United States could see temperatures above 95 degrees for 6 months per year. The New York Times and their analysts looked at a range of potential impacts. They looked at heat, humidity, diminished crop yields, sea level rise, fires, economic damages resulting from all of these changes. And what you're seeing here are some of the most heavily impacted counties, and they're concentrated, as I said, in the Southwest and the Southeast. So you're seeing a lot of dark colors and high numbers because these areas are going to get hit the hardest. If you scroll almost all the way down to the list of counties in the United States, the colors are much lighter and the numbers are much lower because these are the areas that are most likely to be resilient in the face of climate change. And if you'll notice, Clallam County and Jefferson County are doing pretty good according to the New York Times analysis. So people who live in the Southwest and Southeast might be looking our way and thinking it looks pretty comfortable here. Some of them might choose to move to Jefferson and Clallam counties. And one of the things that we tried to do was to come up with a map of potential development. So I'll unpack this a bit more later on in the slide deck here. But one of the things we tried to do was model the likelihood of development based on a variety of factors, and then distribute people within the unincorporated portions of your two counties using population projections by the Washington Office of Financial Management. Each of these black dots represents a new dwelling unit that would be required to accommodate the forecasted population growth to 2050 under current zoning and current development regulations. This is not a foregone conclusion. This is merely a possibility in the future if we do nothing and under the status quo. So in the face of all of these changes that are coming our way, what can we do? Well, we can plan, we can prepare, we can analyze, and we can identify opportunities. So as I said at the very beginning, this was organized across 4 pillars. And the first of these is habitat and biodiversity. The objective for this pillar is to identify lands and features on the landscape that are most likely to retain their ecological integrity and provide opportunities for habitats and species to persist into the future. The stressors that exist now are development, land conversion, which is removing and altering, in some cases, disconnecting habitats. Some of the stressors that are yet to come will be those changes in the temperature regime, some of which we're just beginning to see, and significantly changes in the timing, volume, and temperature of water, invasive species that are here now and more to come, and then the potential for sea level rise and the associated transformations and disappearance of coastal habitats. So to identify those portions of the landscape on the peninsula that are most likely to retain their ability to support functioning ecosystems and biodiversity, we start with this data set. This is the data that brought us here, that started this whole process. This was produced by the Nature Conservancy, and this map is showing the resilience density of the landscape. So the darkest blue areas here have the greatest chance of maintaining functioning habitats and ecosystems. And we know that because they have unique combinations of elevation, slope, soils, microclimatic conditions, and the ability for habitats and organisms to shift and change and move across the landscape over time. So I should emphasize that these areas are resilient. It doesn't mean that we will have the same habitats and species, but it does mean that these areas represent our best chance to have a functioning suite of habitats and species, whatever they may be, in 2050, 2060, 2100. We also want to know which habitats are important right now, according to the agencies responsible for identifying those places. So this grid of hexagons that you're looking at was developed by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and it's also used by our Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to map crucial habitats. So this map is showing the location of crucial habitats. The darkest green hexagons are the most crucial right now in terms of terrestrial and aquatic habitats and species. We also did a bit of our own analysis to identify shoreline conservation opportunities of shorelines that are privately owned, undeveloped, have relatively low percent modifications, contain important marine habitats, and are adjacent to the resilient lands that you saw in the previous slide. One of the ways that we did this was to incorporate additional data. So this is Thorndike Bay, and we were able to obtain some really great data that was produced by the UW Wetland Ecosystem team for the Port Gamble Sklallam Tribe. And this is the type of information we've used across the board that's very detailed, and it does things like showing us which of these coastal habitats are likely to be lost to inundation in blue, which are likely to persist, shown in yellow, and which are likely to be converted to a different type or newly created due to changing sea levels in green. So we've done that for each of the blue circles that you saw, and this one in particular, I believe, has been approved for conservation by the DNR. We also wanted to get a clear sense of the relationship between those important areas that we saw on private land and the existing distribution of public and protected lands. So if we limit our scope, if we just focus in on those hexagons that have some private land ownership within them and are important right now for habitats and species, this is what it looks like. So these are places that are less than 100% publicly owned, so there's private land here. Each of these hexagons is more than 50% covered with resilient lands, and it's very densely resilient, meaning this is sort of the best of the best, and also contains a lot of habitats that are important for what's there right now. And when we look at that in relation to current public and protected lands, we can begin to see that there are some opportunities to protect lands that are adjacent to public ownership and maybe start connecting things together as well. And that brings us to the working forests pillar. So in addition to the habitats, the species, we also want to focus on the ability to identify working forests that will be able to keep producing timber and fiber and other ecological services, and that also might provide opportunities for sequestering carbon time under a range of management scenarios. The stressors for working forests are many. Increasing wildfire potential due to all of those climatic changes that we looked at, increasing damage from insects and disease, changes in forest productivity. There are challenges related to seed supply and reforestation, and an increase in conditions that could trigger landslides, debris flows, forest road damage, and then finally encroachment from development and land conversion out of working forests into some other use. For the opportunities, we want to find places that have high topoclimatic diversity, high resilience, that have a suitable site class, so they're good for growing trees, that can retain water, and provide an opportunity for sequestering carbon. We start with mapping the distribution of working forests. So there are two broad categories. The green areas are inside forest zoning, and the purple are outside forest zoning. And then there's designated forest land and not designated forest land. So we wanted to get a clear picture of what was what and where it was located. Again, we went to the climate resilience data that you've seen already. We got data from the USGS, which is showing opportunities for sequestering carbon. And the best places or the best opportunities for sequestering carbon, according to this data set, are in the darkest green here. And then we produced our own analysis of which parts of the landscape can retain water using a range of variables that I won't go into, but following a methodology developed in Europe. And in this map, the darkest green areas have the highest potential to retain water and suggest that they might be good places for growing trees. When we combine all of those together, what we see is a continuous surface of resilience, site class suitability, and opportunity for sequestering carbon. So the darkest green areas have the highest concentration of those factors. And then if we limit that to the distribution of working forest lands, we can again pretty clearly see that there are some places that might provide some opportunities for maintaining a healthy working forest economy. For the working farms piece, we wanted to, similarly to the working forests, identify agricultural lands that will be the most likely to retain their ability to do what they do best, to produce food and fiber, and which of those will continue to have adequate water supplies. The stressors for working farms are probably well known to this group. There is development pressure on some of the ag lands. Water availability is an issue. The impending transfer of land due to the age of farmers, access to markets for their goods, and then the need to maintain a critical mass of producers so that there are places to get your tractor repaired and buy your seed and your feed. Similarly to the working forests, our first step here was to map the extent of agricultural parcels. So we started with the great data that's produced by the Washington State Department of Agriculture, and this is their 2019 data, plus any parcel that had more than half an acre of ag land according to the USDA's data. We lucked out in terms of timing that we were able to use this wonderful data set produced by the American Farmland Trust as part of their Farms Under Threat program. This is showing the productivity, versatility, and resilience of farmland. The darkest brown areas have the highest combination of those three factors, and then the bluest areas have the lowest. This is the water retention index that you saw earlier. I changed the color ramp a little bit so that the areas that do the best job of retaining water are the darkest blue. And you'll probably notice that they match pretty well with the distribution of ag lands that you saw earlier. So if we combine the productivity, versatility, resilience, and ability to retain water, we end up with this combined score, where the darkest purple areas have the highest concentration of all of those factors. And if we zoom in a little closer to see what that actually looks like on the landscape, so in this case, just northwest of Squim along the Dungeness, we can see where there are patterns of great opportunities for protecting farmland. And similarly, in East Jefferson County, there are good opportunities there as well. And so we can generalize this information and draw general lines around places where there might be great places to protect farms that have the highest likelihood of maintaining their ability to produce food and fiber into the future. For the community piece, our objective was to identify natural areas, open spaces, scenic vistas, recreational amenities, all of which will support the quality of life for residents, for visitors. And then we also wanted to identify areas that are the most appropriate for new and continued development or increased density. This one is not quite finished. We're very close, but there are a few remaining elements that we need to pull together. So what I'm going to show you is some of the preliminary work we've done and some of the inputs we've produced, but not the final piece just yet. The stressors on the community pillar are population growth and the prospect for internally displaced climate refugees. In some cases, poorly planned development, water availability or lack thereof, the need for, and in some cases, lack of viable transportation alternatives to the car, diminished or impeded access to recreational amenities, and then the degradation of scenic landscapes and viewsheds over time. This is the likelihood of future development map that I showed at the very beginning of the slide deck. There were there were 5 variables that we put into this model. And the primary driver that we used was the assessed land value per acre. And the number that you see in square brackets is the weight that was assigned to each of these variables. The assessed land value per acre is the primary driver because we know that the assessors are incorporating a lot of the factors that drive development choices, and that's reflected in their determination of value. Then we also did an analysis to count how many parcels around every parcel are already developed. So that's the percentage of surrounding development, because that seems to be a pretty strong predictor. How close a parcel is to a UGA, a Lammard, Port Ludlow, etc. The potential development per parcel under the current zoning. Can it be subdivided? Is it undeveloped or developed? And then finally, the average slope within each parcel. So the orangest, reddest areas have the highest likelihood based on that criteria. And this is just to zoom in to the eastern portions of the 2 counties. This is the same map that you saw at the beginning, where we distributed population based on average household size until we had distributed the unincorporated rural proportion, the rural share of the forecasted population growth. So the 2 counties get about 8,500 units each, according to the OFM 2050 population projection. This has been useful for a whole range of analyses that we've done. And we also had a look at the viewshed. So where are the areas that are the most visible from a range of observer locations? So we wanted to know which parts of the landscape are the most highly visible, are on private ownership, and have not yet been developed. So we used hundreds of observer locations along main roads and the Olympic Discovery Trail. And we used our digital elevation model to figure out what you could see from each of those, added them all together. And anything that you see here that is orange, green, or blue is highly visible. And it's a little abstract looking at it from this perspective. So if we look at it from an oblique view, this would be us levitating about a mile above the southern end of Port Townsend, looking across Discovery Bay towards Squim Bay. And this is what those areas of high visibility look like. And then if we were to fly our helicopter a little over to the west, and we're looking south into the Olympics, this is what the areas of privately owned, highly visible areas look like. And I want to emphasize, this is just one of the inputs that we're looking at. Eric and I just talked this morning about how we're going to incorporate a range of other variables to come up with our opportunity areas for the community pillar. So to identify those opportunities, we have an advantage. We know that change is coming, and this will give us the chance to prepare thoughtfully for this. And one of the things we're trying to do is identify those portions of the landscape that are not within crucial habitat or important migration or movement corridors, that are fairly close to existing development, utility infrastructure, and transportation infrastructure, and are not within some of those key viewsheds that are still undeveloped that we were just looking at. So conceptually, we can take these opportunities and begin to combine them together. So for example, if we were to look at some of the potential opportunity areas for shoreline conservation, for highly resilient areas that are important for habitats and species right now, and add to that some of the most important opportunity areas for working forest lands, places where we have opportunities to protect working farms, and then just for example, where there are highly visible areas, some of which have not yet been developed, we can start to see that there are places where a lot of these align and where the opportunities will emerge. So the way that this will be used, these data sets and analytical outputs will not provide the answer, but they will provide information to help the 2 land trusts identify opportunities for meeting their conservation and economic development objectives. And I should emphasize, this is just data. It does not preclude the need for doing all of the things that the land trusts are so great at doing, their due diligence, the site visits, all the local knowledge you all possess. And we will be integrating new data over time. And now I'm going to hand it over to Richard Tucker to summarize. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I think you can all see the extent of information and the wealth of information that this study has presented the land trust. And the big question for us was, what do we do with it? And I want to give a little bit of history back. In the middle of 2020, both land trusts entered into a strategic alliance surrounding regarding climate resilience. This study was underway, and it was determined that we would then take the information and start working with it as individual land trusts, but also together. And like I said earlier, there's a wealth of information here. We are now just starting to really digest it. This is one of the first public presentations we have of this information, of what the findings have. And our plan is to then take it internally and start looking at it, saying, what does it mean? And also start applying it to how we vet our work and how we look at our project prioritization. We will be doing individual projects on our own, but also looking at doing some joint projects. And it's been a really exciting time for the Land Trust once again, and we have a history of doing this, is working together to come up with, in this case, some very important information regarding building resilient communities. But we'll be reaching out to other organizations. We'll be seeing it us using this information as we go through and vet our projects and prioritize our projects. But this has been, I think, one of the most important things we've done together. And it will give us a great insight as to where we need to go next. So we'll pretty much stay tuned, because you're looking at, you're overwhelmed. We're looking at, we're going, okay, now we need to use this, and how we're going to use it wisely and strategically. And that's where we are. So just stay tuned, and there'll be more coming for you.
Richard, can I add just one more thing in?
Sure.
I think, so Tom Sanford again, I think what's really important here is that, as you can see with this kind of information, some of it we're finding is going to be really helpful to land trusts, as Richard was just describing. And some of it is stuff that's really about a larger community effort as we overall together build community resiliency. And we really, some of these things are going to come into zoning and land use and CDC work and just all kinds of support to different groups and economic development efforts. And we look forward to working in partnership. And we have some static maps that are becoming available that we're excited to share with folks in this group to help with these efforts. And so I think with that, Karen, if we still have time, we'd love to allow for some Q&A.
Yes, we definitely have time. I'll go ahead and jump in here. Hey, Commissioner Dean, I want to let you know you got to mute yourself if you can hear me. And well, thank you for that wonderful presentation. That's, as you said, that's a lot to absorb. We do have plenty of time for questions and comments. So we can either, if you can either use the raise hand function or put your hand in the air if you've got a question, or you can also type a question in the chat box. I see Jeff Randall has a question. So Jeff, let's start with you.
Thank you. And thank you, Matt. Excellent presentation. Really super interesting. So one quick observation, actually first request, it'd be awesome if you guys are willing to share that presentation with Karen. So those of us who are interested in studying it a little more would have an opportunity to do so. That's a request. And then when you listed the counties that were going to be impacted by climate change, and you scrolled down to the counties that were going to be least impacted by climate change, you focused on Jefferson and Clallam, but also Grace Harbor and Mason were all right there. 4 counties representing the Olympic Peninsula are listed as some of the least impacted in the United States by climate change. So I think your prediction that people are going to be figuring this out and coming our way is accurate. And then a question on the mapping. So every single map, it appears that you have excluded areas identified as urban growth areas, and they're not included in any of the maps. They're just shown as gray. And I'm kind of curious as to what's happening with your projections on population density and how much of the population is anticipated to grow into those gray areas, because they're not shown on the map. So maybe if you could talk about why the gray areas aren't shown, and then how you think they're going to be impacted by the population density. Thank you.
Sure. So I don't know if Michelle or Eric want to elaborate on the focus on areas outside of the incorporated cities and UGAs. But the way that the population was distributed is I used census data to map how many households were located both within incorporated cities, UGAs, and within the unincorporated portions of the county. And I established a ratio, and then I held that ratio constant into the future. So it's the same proportion of people. So even though you're not seeing dots within the cities and UGAs, that's where those new households are going. And as for the focus on the unincorporated portions, it was a conscious decision, because that's where the land trusts are focusing their conservation efforts. At least that was my understanding. That's not to say that the cities and the UGAs aren't important for a whole variety of reasons, but in terms of doing the work on the pillars, that was our focus, was outside of the cities and UGAs.
Okay, and I just want to give some quick feedback. I think these maps are hopefully going to be really useful in terms of, you talked about modifying regulations by cities and counties. There's a lot of good data there. I think somehow in this presentation, you need to early on just say, okay, the mapping that you're going to see is shown in this way for these reasons. And if you're someone representing an urban growth area, here's how to interpret the data, just so that, because I think when we talk about regulations, we're commonly talking about this urban rural thing. So you want to keep the urban people engaged and understand how they're being represented there. That's it.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you.
And Matt, the only thing I would add to your explanation is that one of the reasons we didn't include an analysis of cities and UGAs isn't just because that's not where land trusts are focusing their efforts, but also because the regulations are all different in those areas. And it took so much of your time just to analyze where development could go in the counties. It would have been a huge project to also include our cities and UGAs and Lammerts and Port Ludlow.
Absolutely. And I think that would be a really useful analysis for someone to undertake, because it would provide a similar level of granularity for where population growth might be able to occur in those places that can accommodate it.
Have we got other questions or comments? Bill Putney, I see you raising your hand. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, Matt, thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering, we've got so much land in Jefferson County that is agricultural. It's zoned that way, but it occurs to me that not that much of it produces on a commercial basis. How did you differentiate between the zoned as agriculture versus the actually producing farms and food producers?
Great question. And we use the Washington State Department of Agriculture data. They have a pretty great data set. It's field level data that's produced by analysts manually digitizing off of aerial photos. And I know that every few years they do windshield surveys to ensure that the areas that they are mapping as being agricultural producers are in fact still doing that. They have about a 5% error rate, so for sure there are places that they miss. But as far as I know, it's the best site or the best source of data for giving us that insight.
Great. Yeah, I second Jeff's request that if you can make the PowerPoint or whatever that presentation is available, that'd be great. I know that we've got people on our staff at the port that need to have this information and in a way they can digest it easily.
Other questions, comments? Well, I have one. Are you available, or are you interested in giving similar presentations to other audiences, or would you prefer to disseminate the information a little bit more broadly? I'm thinking of several audiences that I would love to get this in front of. What would be the best way to do that?
Yeah,
Mr.
maybe
Richard,
I can. Oh, go for it, Richard.
One of the reasons why we're recording this presentation today, so we can actually take it to other audiences and present it. We would like to
Yeah.
disseminate it. Mhm.
And so once we can see the quality of the video today, it'll give us a sense of whether that's something we can bring into those kinds of conversations. We're also open to finding other ways to make the presentations happen, just noting, limited bandwidth of the folks doing it, but also excited to share this where we can.
Excellent. All right. Well, last opportunity for questions. Hands raised. Eric, go ahead, please.
I'll just add that, thanks, Matt, that was really great. I'll just add that we'll have all this data at the 2 land trusts as well. So going forward, this is going to be a basis of information, a library of information that we'll continue to use for many years in the future. And so as you all are thinking about this and maybe digesting what we just presented today, know that both land trusts are going to be using this as a part of the foundation of our own conservation planning, and may be able to answer questions or collaborate on questions going forward.
Great. Bill, yeah, go ahead, Bill Putney.
Yeah, Eric, it seems like a tremendous amount of work has been done, at this, kind of point in time. Is there some ongoing funding to kind of freshen up around the edges as we go through time, rather than, leave a big, like 10 years and then come back and do it all over again?
Right. Well, we use GIS quite a bit in our day-to-day work as Land Trust, doing our conservation acquisitions and then our ongoing stewardship work and stewardship planning. So we're going to be using some of this to make even decisions about our ongoing management of properties we already have protected, as well as determining appropriateness or prioritization of properties we are interested in acquiring. And through that process, we'll continuing to use it. We might find ourselves refreshing data sets that have new data available publicly, or otherwise come up with new questions that we want to start to analyze further, and in which case we might even re-engage with Matt at those times. But then we don't have a specific regular funding source for this kind of analysis. It would come at a sort of a project by project basis.
With a commitment that we will be working to keep this up to date. If I still have time, Mark, I would love to ask maybe a question to Karen. Knowing that NODC is in the process now of kicking off some climate efforts, I'm just curious, maybe to kick off for this group, that kind of conversation of how does this kind of information get used within the framework of what NODC is about to approach?
Yeah, Tom, I can try to address that. So the funding that we have from the National Estuary Program to do some regional climate change planning work, it's intended to build on the 2015 report on climate change adaptation for the North Olympic Peninsula. And it's got 3 parts. And the first part of that work is the place where I see this as being the most useful and having the greatest overlap. And that's that we're going to be bringing together local governments and other stakeholders to work on setting some regional goals for climate change adaptation or mitigation for the peninsula. And so this kind of data could feed into that. I have no idea what direction folks are going to want to go in when we get everybody together. One thing that's already come up is transit planning as something that has great potential. But certainly, taking a look at this data and perhaps figuring out ways to use that in planning for conservation and for development is something that could be an outcome. And I would think that having this available would be really useful for that. And then, the second piece that we're going to be doing is a toolkit for local governments who are wanting to do climate change adaptation and mitigation planning, and develop really detailed actionable permit processes or code or ways of looking at things. And so there'll be a lot of samples of language and what's worked other places as part of that. And perhaps this report could even be part of that toolkit, or as an example of something that could be done. And then the third piece will be consultants actually working with 4 or more local governments and on their own particular plans. So, and again, it's possible that some would want to use this. So hope that helps.
Oh, thank you. It really does feel like, thinking about some of Matt's data, while there's some things that are feeling a little daunting, in a relative sense, we on the North Olympic Peninsula really have, I think, the opportunity to maintain a real high quality of life through these changes, just through some smart actions here in the decade ahead. So I actually left this more hopeful than I thought I would, which was a nice thing.
And I just want to say one thing before we close, is that I really appreciate the spirit of cooperation that the Land Trust have developed over the past many years, where we work on projects looking at the landscape in a way that makes sense, rather than just looking at Jefferson County and then Clallam County. I think it really helps the region.
Yep, agreed.
And I certainly would echo all of those comments. And I want to thank you all once again for this really great presentation and for the follow-up that we're looking forward to, in addition to informing the regional climate work that NODC is doing. I think that this is also going to layer very nicely with some collaborative work that I hope is going to be taking off soon between Clallam County and, at very least, the city of Port Angeles, in terms of doing our own climate data collection for county and city facilities, and perhaps a little bit more broadly. So it's really, really great to see some data and some energy behind this. And it's going to be a really exciting couple of years to see if we can rise to the challenge of actually utilizing and making some decisions based on all this information. So thank you guys very much for making time to be here. You are more than welcome to stay for the remainder of our meeting if you are interested in hearing about all the other things that this organization is doing out in the community. But of course, you're under no obligation to stay. So again, thank you guys very, very much for making time to be here today and for that presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it right back over to Karen to take us through the remainder of our meeting today. Karen, thank you.
Thanks, Mark.